Last time, Dr. James Kirkman told us about the city of Gedi, hidden in the dense Arabuko-Sokok forest on the Kenyan coast. A city that should not have existed. A city of 2,500 people with running water and flush toilets and a palace and 3 mosques and trade connections to China and India and Venice and Persia. A city that appeared in no written record anywhere in the world, not in Portuguese documents, not in Arabic manuscripts, not in Swahili texts, not a single mention, not a passing reference, not even a rumor recorded anywhere that might point to its existence. And then the most disturbing detail of all. The strong rooms. Every house in Gedi had one. A special room with thick stone walls and a trapdoor entrance. Built to keep valuables safe. Every single one was empty. Not ransacked. Not forced open. Opened deliberately, carefully, by the people who lived there. Who removed everything valuable. Who carried it all away with them. When they left, all 2,500 of them, deliberately, calmly, together, and never came back. This is episode 2. This is where we ask the question that historians and archaeologists have been asking since 1948. Why did they leave? And the answer, as always with Gedi, is more complicated and more terrible than anyone expected. I want to begin this episode by telling you something that most people do not know about Gedi. The city was not built once. It was built twice. The archaeologists who excavated the site in the 1950s discovered evidence of 2 distinct phases of occupation. 2 separate periods of settlement separated by what appears to have been a period of abandonment. The first city at Gedi was built sometime in the 11th or 12th century, a smaller settlement, the foundations of which lie beneath the more elaborate ruins visible today. This first city appears to have been abandoned at some point, for reasons nobody has been able to determine, and then rebuilt, larger, more sophisticated, more connected to the global trade networks of the Indian Ocean world. The second city, the city whose ruins stand today, reached its peak between the 14th and 16th centuries. This is the Gedi of the palace and the Grand Mosque and the sophisticated water system. This is the Gedi of the Chinese vases and the Venetian glass and the Spanish scissors. The Gedi that traded with half the world and told nobody about it. This second city was abandoned in the early 17th century, which means Gedi was abandoned twice. The first abandonment is almost completely unexplained. The second abandonment, the one in the 17th century, the one that everyone talks about, has at least several theories attached to it. None of them are entirely satisfying. None of them fully explain why 2,500 people left a sophisticated functioning city and never returned. But they are what we have, and they tell a story, complicated and terrible story, about what can happen to a civilization when the world changes around it faster than it can adapt. This is that story. The first theory concerns the Portuguese. In the early 16th century, the Portuguese arrived on the East African coast. They came with ships and cannons and an agenda. They wanted to control the Indian Ocean trade routes, the routes that had been making cities like Gedi prosperous for centuries, the routes that connected East Africa to Arabia and India and China. The Portuguese were not interested in sharing these routes. They were interested in controlling them, taxing them, redirecting them through Portuguese ports and Portuguese ships. For a city like Gedi, whose entire existence depended on Indian Ocean trade, the Portuguese arrival was devastating. The trade that had brought Chinese vases and Venetian glass and Spanish scissors to Gedi's markets began to dry up. The merchants who had been coming to Gedi's harbor stopped coming. The ships that had been stopping along the Swahili coast redirected to Portuguese-controlled ports. Gedi's income collapsed. But here is where the theory becomes complicated. If the Portuguese destroyed Gedi's trade, why did the city not show up in Portuguese records? The Portuguese documented every coastal settlement they encountered, every rival trading post, every source of competition. They do not mention Gedi. Not once. How do you destroy the trade of a city you apparently do not know exists? The theory has answers. Gedi was located 2 miles inland from the coast, not on the shore itself. Perhaps the Portuguese simply never found it. Perhaps they destroyed the trade without ever knowing specifically where the goods were coming from. Perhaps. But a city of 2,500 people that has been trading with the world for 4 centuries. How does it remain invisible to determined colonial explorers for more than 100 years? The Portuguese theory explains some things. It does not explain everything, and everything in Gedi needs to be explained. The second theory concerns the Oromo. The Oromo were a nomadic pastoral people from the Ethiopian interior. In the 16th century, they began a massive southward migration down the East African coast, moving through territories that had been settled and organized for centuries, displacing communities, disrupting trade, creating a wave of instability that moved down the coast ahead of them. The Oromo were known as warriors, as raiders, as people who moved through the landscape like a tide that could not be stopped. By the late 16th century, the Oromo presence north of Gedi was significant. Their raiding parties were moving south. Their reputation preceded them. For a city like Gedi, a city without defensive fortifications adequate to repel a sustained attack, the approaching Oromo may have represented an existential threat. The theory suggests that the people of Gedi saw the Oromo coming, not literally perhaps, but they heard the stories. They saw what had happened to settlements north of them. They understood what the Oromo meant for cities that could not defend themselves. And they made a decision not to wait and fight, not to hope the raiders would pass them by, but to leave, to take their valuables and their families and their community and go somewhere the Oromo were not. This theory has evidence in its favor. The migration patterns of the Oromo in this period are well documented. Their southward movement along the coast is confirmed by multiple sources. But here is the problem with this theory. There is no archaeological evidence of violence at Gedi, no burned buildings, no bodies, no arrowheads or spearheads embedded in the walls, no signs of a siege or an attack. If the people of Gedi left because of the Oromo, they left before the Oromo arrived. They saw what was coming and walked away before it got there, which means they had time, they had planning, they had organization. 2,500 people organized enough to empty their strong rooms and carry their valuables and leave together, long before the threat actually materialized. This requires a level of community organization and collective decision-making that is remarkable. It also raises a question that the Oromo theory cannot answer. Where did they go? 2,500 people do not simply disappear into the African interior without leaving any trace, without any neighboring community recording their arrival, without any oral tradition that says here is where the people of Gedi came after they left their city. They went somewhere. They must have gone somewhere. Where? The third theory is the quietest of the theories, the least dramatic, the most human. Water. Gedi's well-being depended on water. The city had an impressive water system, wells, drainage channels, recycling systems that filtered used water back into the wells. But by the late 16th century, evidence from the archaeological record suggests something was changing. The water table was dropping. This is visible in the archaeology in one specific and heartbreaking way. The well outside the Grand Mosque, the main communal well of the city center, the well that had served the city's religious and civic heart for centuries. At some point in the late 16th century, this well was deepened. It was deepened significantly. The archaeologists could see where the original base of the well had been and how far down the builders had dug to reach the water that was no longer where it had always been. Someone stood at the bottom of that well and dug deeper, desperately. This image of someone standing in the dark at the bottom of a well, digging through coral stone, trying to reach water that keeps retreating. This is the image that stays with me from Gedi, more than the palace, more than the mosques, more than the Chinese vase in the wall. Someone stood in that well and dug deeper, and the water kept dropping. A city without adequate water is a city that cannot survive. 2,500 people need a constant and reliable water supply. The coastal forest is not a desert. Water is there. But if the water table drops significantly, if the wells that have served the city for generations begin to fail, the choice is simple and terrible. Stay and watch the city die slowly, or leave. Take everything valuable, organize the community, walk away together, and find somewhere else to survive. The water theory does not exclude the other theories. The falling water table and the Portuguese disruption of trade and the approaching Oromo and the general instability of the era. These things may all have been true simultaneously. A city does not usually collapse for one reason. Cities collapse when multiple pressures arrive at the same time. When trade fails and water drops and threats approach and the future that once seemed certain suddenly seems impossible. When everything that made the city worth staying in begins to disappear at once. And the people who built it, who loved it, who gave their lives to it, have to make the hardest decision a community can make: to leave. I want to tell you about something that the archaeologists found in the palace. The Palace of Gedi was the largest building in the inner city, a complex of rooms and courtyards and passages. The residence of the sheikh who ruled the city. When Kirkman's team excavated the palace, they found something in one of the inner rooms that has never been fully explained. A collection of objects arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern on the floor. Small objects, personal objects, the kind of things you keep not because they are valuable, but because they mean something to you. A carved piece of wood, a small fragment of decorated pottery, several smooth stones of unusual color, a piece of rope tied in a specific pattern. They were not randomly scattered. They were arranged, deliberately, in a pattern that the archaeologists recognized as having ritual significance, as being the kind of arrangement associated with prayers or ceremonies in Swahili culture. Someone had placed these objects here before leaving, not thrown down in panic, placed carefully, with intention. It looked like goodbye, a farewell ritual performed by someone who understood they were leaving forever, who wanted to do it with ceremony, with dignity, with the appropriate acknowledgement of what was being lost. Kirkman wrote about this discovery in his notes. He wrote, "I do not know who arranged these objects or exactly what they meant, but I know what they feel like. They feel like the last act of someone who loved this place, who left it with grief, who wanted to mark the leaving with something more than simple departure." He was right. That is exactly what they feel like. Someone in the Palace of Gedi, on the day of leaving, perhaps the sheikh himself, perhaps a priest, perhaps an ordinary person who simply could not go without marking the moment, arranged those objects on the floor, said whatever words needed to be said, and walked out of the palace for the last time, into the forest, away from everything their community had built, and never came back. This is episode 2 of The Lost City of Gedi, what happened after the people left, what the forest did to the city in the 3 centuries of silence that followed, and what the local people still believe walks those empty corridors today. That is the story of episode 3, the final episode. Subscribe to Grey Archive Tales, and come back. We will be waiting.